It was a warm afternoon in the busy city of Atlanta. FBI Special Agent Tara Johnson, a brilliant and highly respected black woman, was driving back to her office after completing an intense investigation. She had been working on a high-profile case for months, tracking down a dangerous drug cartel, and she was close to making a breakthrough. Despite the exhaustion from long hours and pressure, Tara felt a sense of pride in her work. It wasn't easy being one of the few black women in a predominantly white male-dominated agency, but she had earned her place. As she drove through the city, her mind raced with the details of the case. She was replaying the latest intel in her head when suddenly flashing blue lights appeared in her rear-view mirror. Surprised, she glanced down at the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Confused, she pulled over to the side of the road, wondering what she could have possibly done wrong. A police car pulled up behind her, and out stepped a tall white officer with a stern expression. He slowly walked up to her window, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Tara rolled down her window, keeping calm as she reached for her FBI badge, ready to explain who she was. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Tara asked politely. The officer, whose name badge read Officer Daniels, barely looked at her license and registration. He barked, not bothering to greet her. Tara was taken aback by his tone but remained professional. "I'm an FBI agent. Here's my badge," she said, holding it out for him to see. Officer Daniels barely glanced at it before frowning. "I said license and registration." Tara's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. She had encountered difficult cops before, but Daniels was different. His cold, dismissive attitude toward her authority as a federal agent sent a chill down her spine. "Officer, I'm a federal agent. I'm on official duty," she reiterated, maintaining her calm demeanor. She was trying to defuse the situation before it escalated. Daniels narrowed his eyes, ignoring her completely. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered sharply. Tara stared at him, shocked by the sudden escalation. "Excuse me, are you deaf?" "I said step out of the vehicle." Daniel's voice rose, drawing the attention of people nearby. Tara hesitated. She knew her rights, and she knew this wasn't right. There was no valid reason for her to be pulled over, let alone be asked to exit her car. But the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. She had been trained to handle high-stress situations, but this felt different. The tension in the air was thick and the racial undertones were impossible to ignore. "Officer, I'm complying with your request, but I need you to understand that I am an FBI agent," she repeated, trying to de-escalate the situation. Daniel's face twisted with disdain as he leaned closer to her window. "I don't care if you're the president. Step out of the vehicle, or I'll drag you out myself." Tara felt a knot in her stomach. She slowly opened her car door and stepped out, keeping her hands visible at all times. The people passing by were starting to watch, whispering among themselves, but no one intervened. Daniels moved toward her, and before she could say another word, he grabbed her roughly by the arm and shoved her against the car. "Hey, what are you doing?" Tara protested, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. "Resisting arrest, huh?" Daniel sneered as he twisted her arm behind her back. "You think you can just flash a badge and do whatever you want, don't you?" Tara winced as the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. She couldn't believe what was happening. This was beyond humiliating. It was an outright abuse of power. As a federal agent, she had the authority to handle cases far more serious than simple traffic stops, yet here she was being treated like a common criminal simply because Officer Daniels refused to recognize her status. People were now openly staring, some even recording the scene with their phones. Tara's face burned with a mix of anger and embarrassment, but she kept her head held high. She knew that she had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't going to let this racist officer break her spirit. "Officer Daniels, you're making a mistake," Tara said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly from the anger boiling inside her. "Shut your mouth," Daniel snapped. "You think you're better than everyone else just because you work for the FBI? Well, let me tell you something, you're not above the law." Tara's mind raced. She needed to stay calm, but she also needed to figure out how to get out of this situation without making it worse. Her colleagues at the FBI would never believe this if she told them. Arrested for no reason while on duty, Daniels dragged her toward his patrol car, ignoring her every attempt to reason with him. As he shoved her into the back seat, she caught a glimpse of the people filming. The bystanders looked shocked, some murmuring in disbelief, but no one stepped forward to help. No one challenged the officer's actions. As the door slammed shut, Tara took a deep breath. She had been through many tough situations in her career, but this felt different. This felt personal. Daniels had crossed a line, and she knew she couldn't let him get away with it. Her mind started working fast. She had to figure out her next move. Would she call for backup? Would she file a formal complaint? She couldn't afford to lose her temper, not now, but she also couldn't let this injustice go unanswered. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Tara's thoughts raced. This was far from over. Tara sat in the back of the patrol car, her wrists throbbing from the tight handcuffs, the cold metal biting into her skin. She looked out the window watching as the city streets blurred past. Her mind was racing. This wasn't just an ordinary arrest, this was something much deeper. Officer Daniels clearly had a personal vendetta, and it was aimed squarely at her. But why was it? Because she was a black woman? Or because he thought he could assert his authority over her without consequence? Either way, it didn't matter now. What mattered was how she would handle this. As they drove, Tara tried to keep her composure. She had been trained to stay calm under pressure, and this situation required every ounce of self-control she had. Her first instinct was to grab her phone and call her supervisor, but she couldn't reach it with her hands cuffed behind her back. She considered asking Daniels to loosen the cuffs, but from the look on his face earlier, she doubted he'd even consider it. Daniels glanced at her through the rear view mirror, a smirk playing on his lips. "You really thought you could get away with pretending to be FBI, didn't you?" he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. Tara's eyes narrowed. "I'm not pretending. I am a federal agent, and you're making a huge mistake," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure you are, and I'm the chief of police." His mocking tone made Tara's blood boil, but she bit her tongue, refusing to engage with him further. It was clear that reasoning with him wasn't going to work. The car came to a stop in front of a small police station on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the usual precinct she was familiar with. It seemed like an older, less used station. Stomach sank as she realized this wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. Daniels had taken her somewhere away from the main precinct, likely to avoid any attention from higher-ups or her colleagues at the FBI. He got out of the car and opened the back door, grabbing her arm roughly as he pulled her out. "Let'n go, agent," he sneered, emphasizing the word agent as if it was a joke. Tara winced as he shoved her toward the entrance of the station. She knew she had to remain calm, but the humiliation and anger were building inside her. She had been through a lot in her career, endless training, dangerous field operations, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of blatant disrespect. "Understood, here's the continuation." It wasn't just about the arrest, it was about being seen as less than because of her skin color, her gender, and her position. Inside the station it was eerily quiet. The few officers who were there barely glanced up as Daniels led her past the front desk. Tara noticed their lack of reaction, as if this kind of behavior from Daniels was normal, expected even. It was a chilling realization. No one was going to step in on her behalf. She was on her own. Daniels pushed her into a small interrogation room and slammed the door shut behind them. The room was dimly lit, with only a small metal table and 2 chairs. He shoved her into one of the chairs, still keeping the handcuffs on. "Let'n get one thing straight," he began, pacing back and forth in front of her. "I don't care who you say you are. As far as I'm concerned, you're just another criminal trying to pull a fast one." Tara glared at him, refusing to be intimidated. "You're violating my rights. You have no reason to hold me, and when this is over you'll regret it." Daniel stopped pacing and leaned in close to her, his face inches from hers. "Is that a threat, agent?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Tara didn't flinch. "It's a promise." He stared at her for a moment, then laughed bitterly. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you? Flashing that badge like it means something. Well, let me tell you something, you're in my territory now." Tara could feel the tension in the air, but she remained steady, meeting his gaze without fear. "I've dealt with bigger threats than you, Officer Daniels. You won't get away with this." Daniel straightened up, his smirk returning. "We'll see about that," he muttered before walking out of the room, leaving her alone. As the door closed behind him, Tara exhaled slowly. She needed to find a way to contact her team. She couldn't rely on anyone in this station to help her, and she was sure that Daniels would do everything in his power to keep her isolated. Her mind raced through her options. There had to be a way to get out of this mess and turn the situation in her favor. She scanned the room, looking for anything that could help. There was a small window near the ceiling, but it was too high to reach, and the door was locked from the outside. The only thing she had was her badge, which she still carried in her jacket pocket, but in her current state, with her hands cuffed, she couldn't even reach it. Minutes passed and Tara's frustration grew. She wasn't used to being in this kind of position. She was always the one in control, the one making the arrests, not the other way around. The power dynamics in this room were entirely different, and she had to figure out a way to regain the upper hand. Suddenly the door swung open and another officer entered the room. This one was younger, maybe in his early 30s, with a nervous expression on his face. He seemed different from Daniels, less sure of himself, less aggressive. He glanced at her, then at the file in his hand. Before speaking, "Agent Johnson," he began cautiously, "I'm Officer Mitchell. I was told to process You for holding, but I just want to say I'm sorry about all this. Tara looked at him surprised. His voice lacked the hostility she had come to expect from Daniels. Maybe, just maybe, he could be an ally. Before she could respond, Daniels appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening as he glared at Mitchell. What are you waiting for? Get her processed, he snapped, his eyes burning with contempt. Mitchell hesitated, his discomfort obvious, but he nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. Daniels lingered for a moment longer, his gaze shifting between Tara and Mitchell before turning and leaving the room again. Tara's eyes met Mitchell's. She had a feeling he might be the key to her getting out of this situation. Tara watched Officer Mitchell with a mix of hope and caution. He seemed uneasy, maybe even sympathetic, but she couldn't be sure. She knew from experience that people in his position often wavered when push came to shove, especially under the pressure of someone like Daniels. Still, she couldn't afford to let any possible opportunity slip through her fingers. Mitchell cleared his throat awkwardly as he pulled a small notebook from his pocket. I'm going to need some information, he said, his voice a bit shaky. It's just routine: name, date of birth, that kind of thing. Tara studied him closely. His reluctance was clear in the way his eyes kept darting to the door, as if he expected Daniels to burst in at any moment. You already know who I am, she replied, her voice calm but firm. What you're doing here isn't right, and you know it. Mitchell's hand froze mid-scribble, and for a brief second their eyes met. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, guilt perhaps, but it was quickly masked by a forced sense of duty. He looked back down at his notepad, avoiding her gaze. I don't make the rules, he muttered under his breath. Tara leaned forward slightly, her voice low and steady. You might not make the rules, but you can decide whether or not to follow orders that you know are wrong. Mitchell hesitated again, the pen trembling in his hand. The tension in the small interrogation room was thick, and it was clear that he was struggling internally. Tara could see the conflict playing out on his face. She had been in enough high-pressure situations to recognize when someone was grappling with their conscience. I can help you, Mitchell, she continued, her tone softening, but you have to help me first. Mitchell looked around nervously, then back at her. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. This isn't how things are supposed to go, he said almost to himself. I know something's off, but Daniels, he's the senior officer, I can't just. Daniels is abusing his power. Tara interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. You've seen it, you know it, and if you don't do something about it now, you're just as responsible. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The weight of her words hung in the air, and he looked visibly torn. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could respond, the door to the interrogation room flew open. Daniels stormed in, his expression hard and angry. What's taking so long, he barked, glaring at Mitchell. She's a simple perp, not a puzzle to solve. Mitchell shot up from his chair, stammering slightly. I was just getting the basic information, sir. Daniels sneered at him, clearly unimpressed. Get her into holding already, we don't have all day. Mitchell nodded quickly, stuffing his notepad back into his pocket. He avoided Tara's gaze as he stood up, motioning for her to follow him, but Tara wasn't done. She knew this might be her only chance to get through to him, and she wasn't about to let fear silence her. You're making a mistake, Officer Daniels, Tara said, her voice steady and authoritative. This is going to come back on you, I guarantee it. Daniels laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. Oh, I'm sure you think so, sweetheart, but in this town nobody cares about your so-called authority. You think just because you have a fancy FBI badge that makes you untouchable. Think again. Tara held his gaze, refusing to back down. I'm not here to impress you, Daniels. I'm here to do my job, and trust me, the people who do care will be coming for you. For a moment something flickered in Daniel's eyes, a brief flash of uncertainty, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual smug arrogance. He waved his hand dismissively at Mitchell. Get her out of my sight, he snapped. Mitchell, clearly rattled, stepped forward and grabbed Tara by the arm, leading her out of the room and down a narrow hallway. As they walked, the tension between them was palpable. Tara could sense that Mitchell was still struggling with what had just happened, but he remained silent. They reached a small holding cell at the end of the hallway. Mitchell unlocked the door and motioned for her to step inside. Tara paused for a moment, looking at him directly. You still have a choice, she said quietly, her eyes locked on his. You don't have to go along with this. Mitchell looked down, his shoulders slumping. He muttered something under his breath, but it was too soft for Tara to hear. Without another word, he shut the cell door behind her and walked away. Tara sat on the small cold bench inside the cell, taking a deep breath. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew she had to stay level-headed if she was going to get out of this situation. Panic wouldn't help her now. Hours seemed to drag by as she sat there alone with her thoughts. Every passing minute only fueled her frustration and anger. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom, she was fighting against the injustice that had led her here in the first place. The blatant racism, the abuse of power, the humiliation, all of it burned in her chest like a fire she couldn't put out. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Tara tensed, wondering who it could be this time. To her surprise, it wasn't Daniels who appeared at the door of her cell but Mitchell. He looked around nervously, checking to see if anyone else was nearby before quickly unlocking the door. Tara's heart raced as he motioned for her to follow him. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her eyes wide with confusion. Mitchell glanced over his shoulder, his face pale with anxiety. "I'm getting you out of here, but we don't have much time." Tara hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to trust him, but she knew she didn't have any other options. If there was even a small chance that he was genuine, she had to take it. Without another word, she followed him out of the cell and down the hallway. They moved quickly through the dimly lit station, avoiding the main areas where other officers might be. Tara's heart pounded in her chest as they reached the back exit. Mitchell paused, pulling out a set of keys and unlocking the door. "This is your chance," he said quietly, looking at her with a mix of fear and resolve. "Get out of here before Daniels catches on." Tara's mind was spinning. Could she really trust him, or was this some kind of trap? She didn't have time to think it through. Tara stood frozen by the back exit, the cold night air creeping in through the small gap as Mitchell held the door open. Her mind raced. Could she really trust him? This entire ordeal had been a nightmare, and after everything she'd been through, it was hard to believe that anyone in that precinct would actually help her. Mitchell glanced nervously at his watch. "We don't have much time," he urged in a hushed voice. His anxiety was palpable, and his eyes kept darting around like he expected Daniels to appear at any second. Tara took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't stay there, especially not after what Daniels had done. But running could only complicate things. She was an FBI agent, after all, and disappearing from a police station would raise too many questions. She was caught between a rock and a hard place. The system, the very one she had trusted and worked for, had betrayed her, and now she had to make a quick decision. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Mitchell hesitated. He opened his mouth to answer but quickly closed it, looking conflicted. His eyes flickered with guilt and desperation. "Because it's wrong," he finally muttered. "What Daniels is doing, it's not just wrong, it's illegal. He's going to pay for it one way or another. But right now, if you stay, you're going to be the one who suffers. You have to get out of here before it's too late." Tara stared at him, trying to gauge the sincerity in his words. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, like he was pleading with her to believe him. But could she? Was he genuinely trying to help, or was he just looking for a way to save his own skin? She couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't add up. But the clock was ticking, and she didn't have time to dwell on it. If Mitchell was telling the truth, staying there would only make her situation worse. If Daniels came back and saw her still locked up, there was no telling what he would do next. Tara knew better than to underestimate a man like him, a man fueled by hate and authority. Taking a leap of faith, she nodded and stepped toward the door. "All right," she whispered. "Let's go." Mitchell's face softened in relief, and he quickly ushered her outside. The cool night air hit her face, sharp and refreshing, and for the first time in hours, she felt a glimmer of hope. They moved quietly, sticking close to the shadows as they made their way through the back alley behind the precinct. Tara's senses were on high alert. Every rustle of the wind, every distant sound of footsteps, sent her heart racing. She was trained for situations like this, but it was different when the threat came from the very people meant to uphold the law. It was unnerving knowing that, at any moment, Daniels could catch up to them. Mitchell led her to a small, beat-up car parked near the alley's end. He fumbled with his keys for a second before unlocking the passenger door. "Get in," he whispered, glancing around nervously. Tara slid into the seat, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Mitchell jumped in on the driver's side and started the engine, the low rumble of the car echoing in the quiet night. As they pulled away from the precinct, the tension in the car was thick. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Tara couldn't shake the unease building in her gut. They were out, but they weren't safe, not yet. Daniels wouldn't let this slide. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, and losing it would only make him more dangerous. Finally, Tara broke the silence. "Where are we going?" Mitchell kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "I'm taking you somewhere safe," he said. "Someplace Daniels won't find you." Tara raised an eyebrow, her skepticism returning. "And what then?" "I can't just run, you know that. I need to deal with this." Mitchell glanced at her, his face tense. "I know. But you need time to figure out your next move, time to gather evidence against him. If you stay here, Daniels will bury you before you even get the chance." Tara leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She hated the idea of running, but Mitchell had a point. She needed more information, something concrete that would expose Daniels and his corruption. But where would she even begin? And how could she trust anyone in that precinct after what had happened? The car sped down the empty streets, the city lights flickering past them in a blur. Tara stared out the window, her mind working overtime. She needed to contact her team at the FBI, but Daniels had confiscated her phone back at the precinct. Her hands curled into fists in frustration. It was one thing after another. "Mitchell," she said suddenly, her voice sharp. "We need to stop. I need a phone." Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. "We can't stop yet. It's too risky." Tara clenched her jaw. "I can't do this without communicating with my people. I need backup if we're going to take Daniels down. I can't be working in the dark." Mitchell sighed, clearly torn. After a moment of silence, he relented. "There's a gas station a few miles up. We'll stop there. You can make your call. But we have to be quick. If Daniels is on to us, we don't have much time." Tara nodded in agreement, her mind already thinking ahead to who she would contact first. She knew exactly who to reach out to, a colleague who owed her a favor, someone she could trust to act fast and discreetly. As they approached the gas station, Mitchell pulled into the dimly lit lot and parked near the side. Tara glanced around, her instincts kicking in. She was always cautious, but now, more than ever, she couldn't afford any mistakes. Every second mattered. She stepped out of the car, her eyes scanning the empty lot as she made her way toward the pay phone. Mitchell stayed in the car, keeping an eye on the surroundings. Tara picked up the phone and quickly dialed the number she had memorized, praying that her colleague would answer. The phone rang once, twice, then finally, a voice answered on the other end. "Tara? Is that you?" Tara's grip tightened on the phone as her colleague's voice came through the line. Relief washed over her, but she knew time was not on her side. Every second that passed increased the risk of Daniels tracking them down. "Yeah, it's me," she whispered urgently. "I'm in trouble, and I need your help. Daniels is dirty. He arrested me for no reason, and now he's trying to cover his tracks." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Tara could hear her colleague, Agent Jackson, taking a deep breath. "All right, calm down. Where are you right now?" "I'm outside a gas station on the outskirts of town. I escaped with the help of one of the officers, Mitchell, but I don't know how long we have before Daniels realizes I'm gone. He's dangerous, Jackson. We need to move fast." Jackson's voice grew serious. "Okay, listen. We'll send backup, but you need to stay low until we get to you." "Do you trust this Mitchell guy?" Tara glanced over at Mitchell, who was anxiously tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, his eyes darting around the dark parking lot. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "But he got me out of that precinct, and right now, he's all I've got." Jackson sighed. "All right. I'm going to pull some strings and get a team to your location, but you need to keep your head down. Daniels won't go down without a fight, and if he realizes you're working against him, things could get ugly." Tara nodded, though Jackson couldn't see her. "I understand. I'll keep moving until you send backup. Don't let me down, Jackson. You know I won't. Stay safe, Tara." The line went dead, and Tara hung up the phone, her mind racing. She felt a surge of determination. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least she had a plan. Backup was on the way, and with Jackson's help, they could finally bring Daniels down. Tara hurried back to the car and slid into the passenger seat. Mitchell glanced at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Everything okay?" he asked. "For now," Tara replied. "I made the call. My team is sending backup, but we can't stay here. Daniels will be looking for us, and it won't take long for him to figure out I'm gone." Mitchell nodded and shifted the car into gear, pulling out of the gas station and back onto the road. The night seemed darker now, the streets eerily empty as they sped through the city. Tara kept her eyes on the side mirrors, scanning for any signs of pursuit. So far, it looked like they were in the clear. As the minutes ticked by, the tension between them grew heavier. Tara couldn't help but replay the events of the night in her mind. Every moment since she'd first encountered Daniels had been a blur of anger, confusion, and humiliation. The way he had looked at her, the sneer on his face as he handcuffed her, still made her blood boil. How could someone like him be in a position of power? She glanced at Mitchell, who had been quiet since they left the gas station. He looked tired, his face drawn and pale in the dim light of the dashboard. It was clear that helping her had cost him something. Whether it was his loyalty to Daniels or his sense of safety, she wasn't sure. But for whatever reason, he had chosen to side with her, and that gave her a sliver of hope. "You didn't have to do this," Tara said softly, breaking the silence. Mitchell sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Yeah, I did. I couldn't just stand by and let him get away with it. Daniels has been corrupt for years, but no one's ever had the guts to stand up to him. He's got the whole precinct wrapped around his finger. I knew that if I didn't do something, you'd end up paying the price for his mess." Tara studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why now?" she asked. "Why did you decide to help me?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flicking to the road ahead. "Because I've seen what happens to people who cross him. I've seen what he does to anyone who threatens his control. And you weren't just another person he could push around. You're an FBI agent. If he took you down, it would send a message to everyone else that no one's safe from him. I couldn't let that happen." Tara nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of his words. Daniels wasn't just trying to humiliate her. He was trying to make an example of her. He wanted to show everyone that even someone like her, someone with authority and power, could be broken under his rule. But Tara wasn't the type to be broken. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to let a racist, power-hungry cop like Daniel strip her of that. She would see this through, no matter what it took. As they drove in silence, the city's outskirts gradually gave way to more rural surroundings. The streets grew narrower, the lights fewer and farther between. Mitchell had taken them far from the main roads, likely in an attempt to avoid being tracked. But Tara knew it wouldn't be long before Daniels figured out they were gone. He'd have the entire precinct looking for them soon enough. After what felt like an eternity, Mitchell pulled into a small, secluded parking lot near the edge of a dense forest. The area was deserted, save for a few scattered buildings in the distance. He cut the engine and turned to Tara, his expression grim. "We'll wait here until your team arrives," he said quietly. "It's out of the way, and Daniels won't think to look here, at least not right away." Tara glanced around the empty lot, her instincts telling her to remain on high alert. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move, and the eerie silence only added to the feeling of unease. But for now, this was the best option they had. She nodded and leaned back in her seat, her mind still racing with thoughts of what was to come. They were safe for the moment, but the danger was far from over. Daniels wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and that meant they had to stay one step ahead of him. Mitchell shifted in his seat, glancing nervously at the dark woods surrounding them. "We should stay quiet," he muttered. "If anyone's following us, we don't want to draw attention." Tara agreed. They had come too far to risk being caught now. As they sat in the car, the minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Every sound outside, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, felt amplified in the stillness of the night. Tara's mind wandered, thinking about what her next move would be once Jackson's team arrived. She couldn't just run and hide forever. She had to take action to ensure that Daniels was held accountable for everything he had done. But that would require a solid plan and more than just backup. She needed proof, something concrete that would expose Daniels for the corrupt cop he was. The stillness of the night was broken only by the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. Tara's mind raced as she and Mitchell sat in the dark, secluded parking lot. The faint glow from the dashboard illuminated their tense faces, and each minute felt heavier than the last. Mitchell kept glancing around nervously, his eyes darting from the rearview mirror to the side windows, scanning for any sign of approaching headlights. Tara noticed his unease, though she couldn't blame him. They were both running from a man with unchecked power, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his secret. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this," Mitchell muttered, breaking the silence. "Daniels has always been a snake, but I didn't think he'd take it this far." Tara turned to him, her voice calm but firm. "He's more than just a snake. Daniels thrives on intimidation, on controlling everyone around him. But his time's running out. I'm going to make sure of that." Mitchell gave a nod but still seemed doubtful. "I get that you want to take him down, but he's got the entire department wrapped around his finger. Most of them are too scared to speak up. They know what happens to anyone who crosses him." Tara sighed. She understood the fear that Daniels instilled in people. She had seen it firsthand when he threw his weight around like he owned the place. But this wasn't just about fear, it was about justice. Daniels had gone too far, and now he was targeting her to cover his tracks. She wouldn't let him get away with it. "What we need is solid evidence," Tara said, thinking aloud. "We need something undeniable that proves he's been abusing his power. Something that can't be dismissed as hearsay." Mitchell frowned, looking unsure. "Easier said than done. Daniels isn't sloppy. He covers his tracks well, and no one in the precinct is going to help us. They're all afraid of what he'll do if they talk." Tara's mind raced. She knew Mitchell was right. Going after Daniels wouldn't be easy, especially when most of the officers in the department either supported him or were too scared to challenge him. But she also knew there had to be a way. Daniels had been corrupt for too long, and people like him always made mistakes eventually. It was just a matter of finding the right thread to pull. "There's got to be something," she said, more to herself than to Mitchell. "A paper trail, an eyewitness, anything." Mitchell stayed quiet, staring out the windshield. The tension in the car was palpable, and for a moment, they both lapsed into silence again, lost in their thoughts. Suddenly, Tara's phone buzzed. She fumbled for it, her heart racing as she saw the screen light up with a message from Jackson. The message was brief but gave her the news she was waiting for: backup is 15 minutes away. "Stay put," **** relief washed over her, though it was short-lived. Daniels might be relentless, but so was she. "Backup's on the way," Tara said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We just have to stay low until they get here." Mitchell nodded, though he still seemed on edge. "I hope they get here before Daniels does." Tara didn't respond. She knew Mitchell was right to be worried. Daniels wouldn't sit back and let her escape without a fight. As far as he was concerned, she was a threat that needed to be eliminated, and he wouldn't rest until she was silenced for good. The quiet night outside was suddenly interrupted by the faint sound of an engine in the distance. Mitchell's eyes widened, and he quickly glanced at the side mirror. "You hear that?" he whispered. Tara tensed, listening carefully. The sound was growing louder, and her stomach churned with anxiety. Was it backup, or had Daniels found them already? Mitchell leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. "I don't like this," he muttered. "We're too exposed out here." Tara's pulse quickened as she strained to see through the gloom. The distant rumble of the engine grew louder, and her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. If Daniels had caught up to them, there was no telling what he would do. "We need to move," Mitchell said urgently, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and Tara's heart pounded in her chest. They couldn't afford to sit around and wait to find out who was coming. Mitchell slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward, tearing out of the parking lot and onto the narrow road. Tara glanced over her shoulder, scanning the darkness for any signs of pursuit. Her hands clenched into fists, and she silently prayed that backup would arrive soon. As they sped down the deserted road, Tara's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. Daniels was closing in, and it felt like they were running out of time. Mitchell swerved onto a side road, the car bumping along the uneven pavement. They were deep into the rural outskirts now, surrounded by thick woods and silence. Tara's eyes darted between the rearview mirror and the dark road ahead, searching for any sign of danger. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "We're heading into the middle of nowhere." Mitchell shook his head, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "It's better than waiting around for Daniels to find us. At least out here, we have a chance." Tara wasn't convinced, but she knew they didn't have many options. They needed to buy time until Jackson's team arrived, and staying on the move was the only way to avoid being cornered by Daniels. As they drove deeper into the woods, the narrow road grew even more treacherous. The car bounced and jolted over potholes and cracks in the pavement, and Tara clung to the door, trying to steady herself. Suddenly, the sound of another car engine echoed through the night, and Tara's heart leaped into her throat. She turned to Mitchell, her eyes wide with alarm. "He's found us," she whispered. Mitchell's face paled, and without a word, he pressed harder on the gas, the car speeding up as they raced down the dark road. Tara's pulse pounded in her ears as the headlights of a vehicle appeared in the distance, growing closer with every passing second. Mitchell muttered under his breath, "Hold on," and swerved the car onto an even smaller road, barely wide enough for one vehicle. The headlights behind them were closing in, and Tara knew they were running out of options. The car swerved violently as they sped down the narrow road, and Tara's heart raced as she clung to her seat, praying they could outrun whoever was chasing them. Mitchell's grip tightened on the wheel as the road twisted and turned through the dense forest. The headlights from the vehicle behind them illuminated the trees, casting long, eerie shadows that flickered across their path. "Whoever that is, they're not giving up," Mitchell said, his voice edged with panic. Tara glanced at the side mirror, her pulse quickening as the car behind them grew closer. The glaring headlights seemed to pierce the darkness, threatening to swallow them whole. She couldn't see who was behind the wheel, but she didn't need to. It could only be one person, Daniels. "He's relentless," Tara said through gritted teeth, her eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. "But we can't let him catch us, not now." Mitchell nodded, his face grim as he pushed the car even harder. The engine groaned in protest as they tore through the winding road, the tires squealing as they rounded each sharp curve. The trees loomed closer on either side, and the road seemed to narrow with every mile. "We're going to lose him," Mitchell said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Tara wasn't so sure. Daniels had already proven that he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and what he wanted was her. She could feel the weight of his obsession pressing down on her like a heavy cloud. He wasn't just a corrupt officer, he was a man who thrived on power and control, and right now, she was the one thing standing in his way. The road ahead suddenly split into two paths, and Mitchell made a split-second decision, veering sharply to the left. The car lurched sideways, and Tara grabbed the dashboard to steady herself. The headlights behind them flickered for a moment before reappearing, now on the same path they had taken. "Damn it," Mitchell cursed under his breath. "He's still on us." Tara's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. They couldn't outrun Daniels forever, especially not on these back roads. They needed to think of something, and fast. "We can't just keep driving," Tara said, her voice tight with urgency. "He'll catch us eventually. We need to do something." Mitchell glanced at her, his jaw clenched. "What do you suggest?" "We're out in the middle of nowhere." Tara's eyes flickered to the forest on either side of the road. The trees were thick and dark, their branches twisting together like a web. It wasn't an ideal hiding spot, but it was the only option they had. "Pull over," she said suddenly. "We'll ditch the car and head into the woods." Mitchell shot her a skeptical look. "Into the woods? Are you serious?" Tara nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's our best shot. Daniels won't be able to follow us through the trees. We can lose him." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as the car behind them inched closer. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. "All right, let's do it." He swerved the car to the side of the road, skidding to a stop just as the headlights of the pursuing vehicle loomed large behind them. Tara didn't waste a second. She flung open the passenger door and jumped out, her feet hitting the gravel with a crunch. Mitchell was right behind her, slamming his door shut as they sprinted toward the thick line of trees. The forest was dark and unwelcoming, but Tara didn't care. They needed to disappear, and fast. The sound of the other car screeching to a halt echoed through the night, and Tara's pace quickened. They didn't have much time. "Come on," she whispered urgently, grabbing Mitchell's arm and pulling him into the shadows of the trees. The thick branches overhead blocked out what little light there was, plunging them into near-total darkness. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, the thick underbrush making it difficult to move quickly. But Tara didn't slow down. She could hear the sound of a car door slamming in the distance, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. Daniels was coming. Mitchell stumbled behind her, struggling to keep up as they weaved through the trees. His breathing was labored, and Tara could tell he was starting to panic. But they couldn't afford to stop now. "We need to keep moving," Tara whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "If he finds us." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what would happen if Daniels caught up to them. They had seen firsthand what he was capable of, and neither of them wanted to experience it again. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Tara's stomach tightened with fear. Daniels was close, too close. They needed to find a way out, or at least a place to hide. "Over here," Mitchell whispered, his voice hoarse as he grabbed her arm and pointed to a thick cluster of bushes up ahead. Tara didn't hesitate. She ducked down behind the bushes, pulling Mitchell with her. The branches scratched at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the approaching footsteps, each one sending a wave of dread through her body. They crouched in silence, barely daring to breathe as the footsteps drew closer. Tara's heart pounded in her chest, and she prayed that the darkness would be enough to hide them. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly, and Tara's breath caught in her throat. She could hear someone standing just a few feet away, the soft rustle of leaves under their boots the only sound in the still night. Her mind raced. What if Daniels found them? What if he knew exactly where they were hiding? She could feel Mitchell trembling beside her, and she silently prayed that he would stay quiet. For what felt like an eternity, they remained frozen in place, waiting. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, this time moving away from them. Tara let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through her. "He's going the other way," Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible. Tara nodded, though her body remained tense. Daniels might have moved on for now, but she knew he wouldn't give up that easily. They were far from safe. "We can't stay here," Tara whispered, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. "We need to keep moving." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Together, they carefully stood up and began making their way deeper into the woods, their footsteps barely making a sound on the soft forest floor. The night stretched on, and with every step they took, the weight of Daniel's pursuit hung over them like a storm cloud. Tara knew that they couldn't keep running forever. But for now, all they could do was stay one step ahead. Their breaths were shallow, and their movements deliberate, as if the very trees around them might betray their presence. The forest seemed alive, every rustling leaf or snapping twig amplifying their anxiety. Tara clenched her jaw, forcing herself to focus on the uneven ground ahead. Each step had to be calculated, a misstep could mean their end. "Do you think he's still close?" Mitchell whispered, his voice trembling. Tara glanced back, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. "Close enough," she muttered. "But he's methodical. He'll try to flush us out before rushing in. We need to stay unpredictable." Mitchell swallowed hard, clearly uneasy. "Unpredictable how?" "Move in zigzags," Tara instructed, her voice barely audible. "Keep low and avoid leaving a trail." The moonlight filtered faintly through the dense canopy, casting ghostly patterns on the forest floor. Tara's FBI training was kicking in, and her mind raced with strategies to outmaneuver Daniels. She could feel Mitchell's fear, but she had no time to soothe him, staying alive took precedence. They came across a shallow stream, its water glinting faintly under the moonlight. Tara crouched down, motioning for Mitchell to follow. "Step in," she said. "We'll walk along the water to mask our tracks." Mitchell hesitated, shivering as the cold water seeped through his shoes. "This guy's insane," he muttered. "Why won't he just leave us alone?" "Because he's not just a cop," Tara replied, her voice grim. "He's a predator. And we've cornered him." They waded silently through the stream, their feet splashing lightly against the current. The sound of distant footsteps faded, but Tara remained on edge. Daniels wasn't the type to let his prey go easily. After what felt like hours, they reached a rocky embankment. Tara climbed out first, extending a hand to help Mitchell. As they both crouched behind a large boulder, she allowed herself a moment to assess their surroundings. The forest here was denser, the trees gnarled and ancient. It was a good place to hide, but Tara knew it was also a trap if Daniels caught up to them. Mitchell slumped against the rock, his chest heaving. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," he confessed, his voice breaking. Tara placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You can, and you will. We're almost out of the worst of it. But you need to hold on, Mitchell. If we stop now, he wins." The resolve in her voice seemed to steady him, and he nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. They both froze as a faint rustling reached their ears. It wasn't close, but it was unmistakably human. Daniels was still hunting them. Tara's mind worked rapidly. They needed a distraction, something to throw Daniels off their trail. Her eyes landed on a broken branch nearby, its jagged edges pointing upward. An idea began to form. She turned to Mitchell. "Listen carefully," she whispered. We're going to set a trap. It's risky, but it's our best shot at buying time. Mitchell's eyes widened. A trap? Are you sure? Tara nodded. Trust me. Daniels thinks he's in control. Let's prove him wrong. The next few minutes were a blur of quiet but purposeful movement. Tara worked quickly, arranging branches and debris into a crude but effective snare. The plan wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be, it just needed to slow Daniels down. Now we move, Tara whispered once the trap was set. Stick to the left, and whatever happens, don't look back. Mitchell hesitated, then followed as Tara led him deeper into the woods. The sound of their breathing was the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. Somewhere behind them, Daniels was still closing in, but Tara refused to let fear dictate her actions. For now, their survival hinged on staying ahead, and staying together. The woods grew darker and more foreboding as they pressed on, the thick canopy blocking out what little moonlight remained. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of moss and decaying leaves. Every step felt like a gamble, the forest floor littered with roots and stones that could betray them with a single misstep. Tara's senses were on high alert, her ears straining to catch any sound beyond their own cautious movements. Daniels was out there, somewhere, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he found them. The man thrived on control and domination, and she had stripped that from him the moment she escaped. Mitchell stumbled over a root, catching himself just in time to avoid falling. Tara stopped and turned, placing a finger to her lips. His breathing was loud and ragged, and she worried it might give them away. She motioned for him to crouch down and rest for a moment. Just a second, Mitchell panted, his face pale. I need to catch my breath. Tara scanned the area, her heart pounding. We can't stay here too long, she said softly. But okay. 1 minute. She crouched beside him, her back pressed against a tree trunk. Her thoughts raced as she tried to piece together their next move. They couldn't keep running aimlessly through the woods. Eventually, they'd either tire out or end up cornered. They needed a destination, somewhere safe, somewhere Daniels wouldn't expect. Do you know these woods at all? Tara asked, keeping her voice low. Mitchell shook his head. Not really. I've driven past them, but I've never been out here. It's mostly private land. Tara frowned. Private land meant they might encounter more than just Daniels, unfriendly locals, guard dogs, or worse. But it also meant there might be an old barn or hunting cabin nearby, something they could use as temporary shelter. We need to find higher ground, she decided. If we can spot a clearing or a structure, we'll have a better chance. Mitchell nodded weakly, his exhaustion evident. Tara helped him to his feet, and they continued their cautious trek, weaving through the dense trees and uneven terrain. A distant sound froze them both in their tracks. It was faint but unmistakable, the crunch of boots on fallen leaves. Daniels was closer than she'd thought. Tara's pulse quickened, and she instinctively reached for her waistband, her hand brushing against the grip of her firearm. She had almost forgotten it was there, a small comfort in the chaos. Mitchell glanced at her, his face a mixture of fear and desperation. What do we do? He mouthed. Tara's eyes darted around the darkened forest. They couldn't afford another chase, not with Mitchell barely holding it together. She spotted a fallen tree nearby, its massive trunk partially hollowed out by rot. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. Get in there, she whispered, pointing to the hollow log. Stay quiet and don't come out until I say. Mitchell hesitated, but the urgency in her tone left no room for argument. He squeezed himself into the log, his breathing shallow and rapid. Tara crouched low, her hand gripping her gun as she positioned herself behind a thick tree. She needed to buy him time to recover, but more importantly, she needed to deal with Daniels. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Daniels wasn't running, he was stalking, taking his time like a predator savoring the hunt. Tara could feel the tension in the air, a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. She steadied her breathing, her training kicking in. Patience and precision would be her allies now. A faint beam of light cut through the darkness as Daniel's flashlight came into view. Tara stayed perfectly still, her body pressed against the tree. The light swept across the forest floor, searching, probing. She could hear his voice now, low and taunting. "You think you can hide from me, Agent Lawson?" Daniels called out, his tone dripping with malice. "You're only making this harder on yourself. Come out now, and maybe I'll go easy on your little friend." Tara's grip on her gun tightened. She peeked around the tree, catching a glimpse of Daniel's silhouette. He was close, maybe 20 feet away, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Her mind raced. She could try to ambush him, but she needed the element of surprise. As Daniel stepped closer, his flashlight beam swept dangerously near the fallen tree where Mitchell was hiding. Tara's heart pounded. She couldn't let him find Mitchell, he wasn't equipped to handle a confrontation with someone like Daniels. "Hey!" Tara called out, her voice firm and clear. Daniels froze, his flashlight snapping toward her direction. She stepped out from behind the tree, her gun aimed steadily at him. "It's over, Daniels," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "Drop the flashlight. Drop the weapon." Daniels chuckled, his smirk illuminated in the beam of his own flashlight. "Agent Lawson," he drawled. "I was hoping we'd have a little chat." Tara didn't lower her gun. "You've got 2 seconds to comply, or I swear I'll make this easy for the both of us." Daniel's smile faltered for a brief moment, but then he took a step closer. "You don't have it in you," he sneered. "You're not a killer. You're too by the book." Tara's jaw clenched. "Try me." The tension between them was electric, the forest around them deathly silent. Daniels raised his hands slowly, his flashlight clattering to the ground. But the glint of something in his other hand caught Tara's eye, a knife. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice sharp. Daniel's smile returned, sinister and unrepentant. "You'll have to take it from me, Agent." The standoff stretched on, and Tara knew she was out of time. Daniels lunged forward with a sudden burst of aggression, the knife in his hand flashing in the dim light. Tara's instincts took over. She sidestepped his attack, pivoting on her heel as she brought her firearm up, the cold steel steady in her hands. "Drop it," she barked again, her voice ringing out through the stillness of the forest. Daniels turned quickly, his movements sharp and calculated. His face twisted with rage, the smirk now replaced by raw hatred. "You think you can take me down?" he snarled, his chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. "You're just another pawn in their game." Tara tightened her grip on the gun. She couldn't let him close the distance again. "This is your last chance, Daniels. Drop the knife, or I will drop you." For a moment, the forest held its breath. The distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of nocturnal creatures were the only sounds. Tara could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. He was calculating, looking for an opening, but Tara wasn't about to give him one. She took a step forward, her aim unwavering. "Don't make me do this." "Do it," Daniels challenged, his voice low and venomous. "Show me you're not just some bureaucratic pencil pusher." He lunged again, this time faster. Tara didn't flinch. A loud crack shattered the silence of the forest as her gun discharged. Daniels cried out in pain, the knife slipping from his hand as he stumbled back, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. Tara advanced cautiously, her weapon still trained on him. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice icy. "It's over, Daniels." But Daniels wasn't finished. Even as blood seeped through his shirt, he glared at her with a mix of fury and desperation. "You think this ends with me?" he spat, his voice trembling. "You don't know what you've walked into, Agent Lawson. There are bigger players at work, and they'll come for you too." Tara's eyes narrowed, but she didn't waver. "Let them. Right now, I'm only worried about you." The sound of rustling behind her made her spin around, her gun raised. Mitchell emerged from the hollow log, his face pale but determined. He held a thick branch in his hands, clearly ready to defend himself if necessary. "I couldn't just stay there," Mitchell said, his voice shaky but resolute. Tara nodded, her focus snapping back to Daniels, who was now slumped against a tree, his breathing labored. "Mitchell, grab his knife and flashlight," she instructed, her tone firm. Mitchell obeyed, cautiously approaching Daniels and kicking the knife away before picking up the flashlight. Tara kept her gun trained on Daniels the entire time, her senses on high alert. "What now?" Mitchell asked as he stepped back, the flashlight illuminating Daniels' grim expression. "We secure him and call for backup," Tara said. "This ends tonight." Daniels chuckled weakly, his head leaning back against the tree. "You're going to regret this, Lawson," he muttered. "You don't even know what you've started." Tara stepped closer, her gun still steady. "You're done, Daniels. Whatever corruption you're part of, whoever you're working for, it stops here." The faint sound of sirens in the distance made Tara's heart leap with relief. Help was finally on the way. She kept her focus on Daniels, unwilling to take any chances, but a flicker of hope sparked in her chest. Mitchell looked toward the sound, his shoulders sagging in visible relief. "They're coming," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Tara nodded but didn't lower her gun. "Stay alert. It's not over until he's in cuffs." The sirens grew louder, the flashing blue and red lights cutting through the darkness as the police cars arrived at the edge of the woods. Officers poured out, their weapons drawn as they advanced cautiously toward the scene. "Agent Lawson," one of them called out. "Stand down, we've got this." Tara lowered her weapon but didn't let her guard drop entirely. She stepped back, allowing the officers to take control. Two of them moved quickly to secure Daniels, who was too weak to resist but still managed to sneer at her as they cuffed him. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice laced with venom. Tara ignored him, turning to Mitchell. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone softening. Mitchell nodded, though his hands still trembled slightly. "I think so. What about you?" Tara exhaled deeply, the tension finally beginning to leave her body. "We'll get through this," she said, more for herself than for him. "It's far from over, but for now, we've won." As the officers led Daniels away, Tara and Mitchell exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the ordeal they had survived together. The forest, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now felt like a battlefield they had conquered. But Tara knew the fight wasn't finished. Daniel's cryptic warnings echoed in her mind, hinting at a larger conspiracy she couldn't ignore. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready to face it. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. As the officers escorted Daniels toward the waiting patrol cars, the tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. Tara holstered her weapon but kept her eyes on Daniels, his earlier threats still echoing in her mind. She knew better than to dismiss his words, there was truth buried in his malice. Mitchell sank onto a fallen log nearby, his exhaustion evident in every movement. He buried his face in his hands, taking deep, steadying breaths. Tara crouched beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did good," she said softly. "You kept it together when it mattered." He looked up at her, his face pale and lined with worry. "I wasn't sure I could. Daniels, he's like a force of nature. I didn't think anyone could stop him." Tara gave him a faint smile. "Everyone can be stopped. You just have to be willing to stand up to them. One of the officers approached, his expression respectful but firm. Agent Lawson, we've got Daniels in custody, and medical is on its way to treat his injuries. Is there anything else we should know about this situation? Tara straightened, her professional demeanor returning. Daniels isn't just a rogue officer, he's part of something bigger. He hinted at a larger operation, possibly involving corruption within the precinct. You need to secure him and any evidence he might have on him or at his residence. The officer nodded. Understood. We'll handle it. But you should know, this isn't going to sit well with some folks back at HQ. Tara's jaw tightened. I'm not here to make people comfortable. I'm here to make sure justice is served. The officer gave her a slight nod of respect before walking back to his team. Tara turned her attention back to Mitchell, who was watching the scene with a dazed expression. You okay to move? She asked. Mitchell nodded slowly. Yeah. I think so. Good. Because we're not done yet. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was electric with tension. News of Daniel's arrest had spread like wildfire, and every officer seemed to be on edge. Tara walked through the halls with Mitchell by her side, her presence commanding respect and apprehension in equal measure. She entered the interrogation room where Daniels was being held. He sat cuffed to the table, his expression a mix of defiance and disdain. The wound on his shoulder had been cleaned and dressed, but the bandage didn't soften his menacing demeanor. You came to gloat? Daniels sneered as Tara took a seat across from him. No, she replied evenly. I came to get answers. Daniels leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. You think locking me up is the end of this? You don't even know what you've stepped into. Then enlighten me, Tara said, her tone sharp. What are you so desperate to hide? Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. You're out of your depth, Lawson. You think taking me down changes anything? There are people higher up, people who make me look like a saint. And they won't let you disrupt their plans. Tara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Then give me names. If you're going down, take them with you. Daniel's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Why would I do that? I've got nothing left to lose, and dragging them into this only shortens my lifespan. Tara studied him carefully, noting the flicker of fear behind his bravado. He wasn't as unshakable as he wanted her to believe. You can play the martyr if you want, but we both know you're not ready to die for this. Cooperate, and maybe you'll get a deal. Daniels hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might crack, but then he leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. You'll never win. The people you're up against, they don't play by the rules. And they sure as hell won't go down without a fight. Tara's gaze didn't waver. Neither will I. As she stood to leave, Daniels called after her. Be careful, Lawson. You dig too deep, and you might not like what you find. Outside the room, Mitchell was waiting, his face pale but determined. Did he tell you anything? Not yet, Tara replied, her mind already working on her next move. But he will. People like Daniels always talk eventually. It's just a matter of time. Mitchell nodded, though his unease was clear. What happens now? Tara looked down the corridor, where officers were working tirelessly to process the evidence against Daniels. Now, we keep pushing. Daniels is just the start. Whatever he's protecting, whoever he's working for, we're going to uncover it. As the two of them walked out of the precinct, the weight of the night's events still heavy on their shoulders, Tara felt a spark of resolve reignite within her. Daniels was right about one thing, this wasn't over. But neither was she.